IOSH Networks Audio.
Okay, so my name's Debbie Green. I'm here from NEMCO. The idea this morning is to whip you through a quick history of Legionella, talk about the bacteria, the disease, the risk areas associated. We've got a couple of case histories to cover, and the idea is that by the end of this, you'll all still be awake and you'll be hanging around because there will actually be some food as well. So we'll get straight in with it. Yeah. The first question I'm going to ask you is it worth worrying about? You know, we had a chat just before things kicked off about how many people actually know somebody who's had Legionnaire's disease. And, you know, it's not a common thing. There are other things that we should be worried about. We've got, you know, the asbestos to worry about. We've got noise at work. We've got dermatitis. We've got all sorts of different things that we need to be concerned about. So why should we worry about some little bacteria that might be sort of hanging around in our water system? I'm not going to answer that question. Maybe we'll consider it again at the end. But this is what we're here to talk about. Legionella bacteria, it's microscopic. You obviously can't see it with the naked eye, but this is what it looks like if you stain this and put it under a microscope. And the problem is you can't see it. We will often call it the invisible killer because it's something that we kind of take for granted, that if we get a glass of water or we start moving water about, that there's nothing in it. And actually, there's all sorts of things in our water, including these little things. So legionellosis is the name of the group of illnesses that are caused by Legionella bacteria, and it is a waterborne bacteria. People think about Legionella being associated with air conditioning, and it's actually the water called air conditioning that's the problem. It has to be suspended in a water droplet to be viable. Legionella is quite naturally widespread in the environment. It lives in rivers and lakes and has done so probably for the last sort of 50 million years or so, minding its own business. It's only because of the way that we use and store water now that we've kind of made an enemy out of this bacteria. It's been doing its own thing for a long time. Now, I've been working in the Legionella field for about 18 years, and when I first started doing these presentations, there were 18 different species of Legionella bacteria. Now, there are over 50 different species. Now, we don't know if it's just that it's taken this long to identify them all, and that they were there all along, or whether the actual strains of bacteria have, over a period of time, mutated and we've got new species coming about because they're adapting to their environment. Of those 50, there are 20 that are known to cause disease in man, but it's actually pneumophila that we're particularly concerned about because this is the one that gives rise to Legionnaire's disease. Now, those of you who have a Latin-based education will probably already know that pneumophila quite literally means love of the lung. And obviously we'll understand more about that as we go along. There's also a couple of other diseases that you may have come across in your profession, Pontiac fever and Lock-Gall head fever. Now these are self-limiting forms of Legionella. So what it means is that the bacteria dies out before the host does, whereas with Legionnaire's disease there's a good chance that you might die from it. So, like everything else, these bacteria, they need a certain set of conditions to be able to live and to be able to grow. Temperature is absolutely critical. This range of 20 to 50 degrees C, you'll hear all sorts of different things quoted, 20 to 45, 50, 60, but actually the key thing to remember is that below 20 degrees C, so cold water, below 20 degrees C, it will not kill Legionella bacteria. Legionella can actually survive freezing. So if you're going to have cold water that you're then going to allow to heat up at a later date, then the bacteria, although it's in a dormant state below 20 degrees C, above 20 degrees C, it can actually come out of that hibernative phase, if you like, and start to grow. Between 20 and 45, it will grow quite rapidly, and then between 45 and 50, it will tail off, and certainly above 50 degrees C, Legionella won't grow. 60 degrees C, which is the temperature that we recommend storing hot water at, the death rate is virtually instantaneous. So temperature is really critical. The other thing is, obviously, it grows best 37 degrees C, what's that? Human core body temperature. So once it's actually within our systems, it makes a very efficient attack on the human body. It obviously needs some sort of food source. Now, Legionella's quite keen on eating other bacteria, amoebae, algae, moulds, that kind of thing, just general nutrients that are in water. But it also really loves things like iron. So if any of you have got kind of water systems where there's a few areas that don't get used very often, and when you run the taps it all comes out like a brown sludge, that's where the pipework started to corrode. And anything that has iron deposits in it will be a really good food source for Legionella bacteria. Same with things like old galvanised tanks that have started to corrode. The rust byproducts obviously really good for Legionella. It much prefers slow-moving or stagnant water. So if you've got water constantly on the move, then Legionella will simply get washed out of the system. So anywhere that's nice and quiet and undisturbed, stagnant water will generally heat up to the ambient air temperature. And if that's above 20 degrees C, then again, Legionella is going to come out of hibernation if it's there and start to grow. All of these things in a workplace we would consider to be indicators of a poorly managed water system, and it's these things that give rise to this perfect environment for bacteria to grow. Now, when I first got involved with Legionella, there was an HSE video, so it was a while ago because there were videos at the time, and it said there are no issues with Legionella bacteria in domestic water systems. I thought, well, I don't think Legionella bacteria really cares or knows whether it's in a domestic or a commercial environment. It doesn't. So that's absolute rubbish. It can certainly occur in a domestic situation, but obviously it's the legislation at work that we're particularly concerned about. I did an IOSH branch meeting a little while ago in London, and this guy put his hand up at the end and he said, I've got a water system and I've also got like a guest room with its own shower, like an ensuite system, and it's right at the end of the run, and the water doesn't sort of circulate past it, so it's effectively it's a dead leg. So I said, well, what do you do? Do you flush it, or do anything with it? And he said, no. And I said, well, who would use it? And he said, well, really, only the mother-in-law at Christmas. So I said, have we got a problem? So certainly it can occur in a domestic environment and does, but obviously the workplace is what we're concerned about. Anybody know where this first came from? It was the American Legionnaires. Yeah, the Americans found it first. July 1976, at the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia, there was a mystery illness that occurred. 182 cases and 29 of the American Legion guys died. And of course the government scientists all piled in there and said, what's going on? Why are these people getting ill? And of course the natural assumption straight away was, is it something they've eaten? But they quickly discounted that, not least because of those cases, there were 38 that were people passing by this hotel. So they knew then it must have been something environmental. And eventually, they traced it back to a cooling tower on the roof of this hotel that had bacteria in it. And they realised that that was actually what was causing the problem. So obviously, Legionella the phrase was coined, and Legionnaire's disease after the guys who died. But what some of you may not know, a bit of trivia, this will come up in a pub quiz once, so you'll have to remember. But about 2 years prior to this, there was a similar outbreak. The same thing occurred, it was the same hotel, there were fewer cases, but on that occasion they didn't isolate the bacteria, they didn't actually trace the source. If they had, that was at a convention of the Oddfellows. So you'd be here for like Oddfellows awareness training or something today. Random fact. So how big a problem is this? Each year we record 300 plus cases in England and Wales. So we're not talking about masses of cases being reported, but we know that this is a major area of our downfall. There's been a steady rise in cases since 2002. Now, what happened in 2002? Anybody know?
The Northwest incident.
Britain's biggest outbreak, yeah, the Barrow-in-Furness case. Now, it may be that since 2002 there's been a heightened level of awareness because people, it hit the newspapers and people were kind of a little bit more conscious about Legionella. But there are other factors involved which we'll come on to. With work that we're doing over in Europe, we know that actually Legionella could be responsible for quite a proportion of community-acquired, or what's being listed as community-acquired pneumonia. So we know that the real figures are probably more likely to be something like 9,000 cases each year in England and Wales. The reason that it's so difficult to work out where this has come from is that treatment is cheaper than testing. So if you present at hospital with symptoms of pneumonia, you will be given antibiotic treatment. They are not going to test you for Legionnaire's disease unless they've got reason to believe or suspect that you might have been exposed to the bacteria, or if there've been a cluster of cases, a potential outbreak. Other than that, you've got pneumonia, that's what's going to go down on your records. So you know that particularly with elderly people, common cause of death is pneumonia. But how many of those cases are actually caused by Legionella bacteria? Because that is utterly preventable. If you are unlucky enough to catch Legionnaire's disease, then there's a 10 to 12% chance that you're going to die from it. even if you survive it, then the consequences are massive. People who get Legionnaire's disease take a very long time to recover from it. You can end up in a coma, you can lose limbs, you can lose your sight or lose hearing. Because it's such a debilitating disease, it can take up to 18 months to get back to work, if at all. So this is not a good, if you're going to catch Legionnaire's disease, this is not a good disease to survive in many ways. You've only got to Google Legionnaire's disease and you'll get countless people's records of what's happened to them and how they've been affected by this horrible disease. And it is a respiratory disease. Despite a lot of information about Legionnaires being out there, a lot of people still think it's to do with drinking the water. There was an outbreak in Norwich a few years ago now, and at the time, they never actually determined where the source was, but at the time the council started handing out bottled water to residents in flats where they thought there might have been a problem. And we said, why are they doing this? And there was signs up saying, don't drink the water, Legionella. We said, well, drink away, you know, it's got nothing to do with drinking water. There was an American scientist who at one time said, you know, over a period of time at a very high level, if you consumed enough water containing Legionella, then you might catch disease. But generally in this country, we say that's not really a risk. It's certainly something to do with it, you getting it into your lungs. So, of course, to get a water droplet from here and into your lungs, it has to be in a very fine aerosol mist. So we have to have the droplet so small that you can breathe it in. If you think about getting in the shower, it's not the droplets that are washing you, it's actually the kind of the fine mist, the haze that you can see against the light. That's what we're worried about, because that's where the bacteria would be. Obviously, once you breathe them in, 37 degrees C, they're in your lungs, bingo, they're going to start to grow. And it's actually the toxins that the bacteria produce as part of their reproductive cycle that kind of turn your lungs to mush. So in terms of cases, we mentioned that the number of cases have been rising since 2002, and certainly that is the picture. In fact, 2011, although this was taken about halfway through the year, this study, the actual number of cases in 2011 exceeded 600. So we know that we're recording more cases. And again, it may be that people are just slightly more aware, or it may be that environmental factors have a part to play, or other sort of sociological factors have a part to play. In terms of who's at risk, what does this graph say? Who's most at risk? Gents, you are 3 times more likely to catch Legionnaire's disease than your female colleagues. Good news for us, ladies. Why? I've heard them all. Yes, it could be that men shower more. Or any other ideas? Yeah, certainly these days that's what we believe to be the case. A lot of people for a long time said it was all to do with the workplace. In terms of ratios and numbers, particularly in environments where guys were working on plumbing systems, maintenance, those kind of industries, you know, you would expect that kind of 1-to-3 ratio, but it never explained why, even in children and young adults, there's always this 1-to-3 ratio, even though they're the smallest risk group. So yeah, it's highly likely to have something to do with the fact that guys have a bigger lung capacity, therefore a bigger surface area for the bacteria. There's also another theory that suggests that females actually have a higher immune response to bacteria. It's all something to do with childbirth, apparently so. I was born in Yorkshire, and I lived in Hull. My early years were in Hull, so it was all very nice coming over the bridge today. Evoked lots of memories. I'm now a softy southerner, and I live near Bury St Edmunds, but I lived for a long time in Norwich, so I feel kind of qualified to do this. When I first moved down there, I said, oh, come on, let's go and play on grass. And the kids would just look at me like, you are? In their Norwich accent. And I gave a talk there a while ago, and we sort of had this discussion, and one engineer stuck his hand up and he said, I know why that is. So I said, go on. He said, it's you bloody women, you never stop talking. If you never stop to catch your breath, how can you ever catch the Legionnaire's disease? So I thought, well, actually, there's probably a lot of truth in that. So that's like my favourite explanation, I think. So yeah, certainly gender is a factor. So is age. So we've got this peak here at sort of the 50 to 60 bracket. In fact, the older you are, the more at risk you are. The reason that the graph tails off is because when this study was done, there were fewer people in this age group. Obviously, as time goes on, we expect to see that go up. Certainly, it will flatten off. So it's all to do with how old you are. So obviously if you're working in a profession where you're dealing with elderly care, then they're going to be your highest risk group. People who smoke, we've got any smokers in the house? Yeah, a few. So heavy smokers particularly, they're more at risk. People who've got any kind of lung function issues, so if you've had bronchitis or if you have asthma or anything like that, you're going to be more at risk. People who are immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, either because they've had a transplant or maybe they are taking drugs for HIV, all of these people will fall into the higher risk bracket. But in the workplace, how do you know who they are? The other thing is that there's a study that's ongoing at the moment that says actually only 1% of the population is predisposed to Legionella. Now this is quite interesting because if we can actually identify who those people are, then that might help us in the way that we manage Legionella. But what it's to say is if we get 100 people in a room and expose everybody to the same amount of contaminated aerosol, actually only one person might be susceptible to the bacteria. But again, how do you identify those in your workplace? We have to kind of cater for the majority, even though it's probably a minority that could be affected. Now, we mentioned that there's quite a lot of work going along. It started with UDLINet in this country, and now Europe has actually taken on the mantle for doing surveillance on cases of Legionnaire's disease. Now, down at the bottom here, we've got this lovely purple colour, which shows that the UK has the lowest number of reported cases, and it's actually got them across age groups as well. So I'd like to think that we're doing pretty well. Well done us. Obviously, we've got good legislation, we've got people who are really committed in health and safety professions, but then having been to the Netherlands, I know that this is also the case there. So this just goes to show that actually the reason that our numbers are so low is probably less to do with how good we are, and more to do with the fact that we're really bad at reporting this and recording it. So it's interesting to see. Obviously, weather has an awful lot to do with when cases occur. Generally, there's this peak over the summer period. That's usually because you've got higher incoming mains water temperatures, which will be affecting whether or not you can keep your own temperatures below 20 degrees C. But also, this is the time when the air conditioning goes on, isn't it? So pretty much from June onwards, we get these big peaks in numbers. Now, Legionnaire's disease cases are happening all the time, but most cases are sporadic. The ones that you hear about in the media, the outbreaks, are generally caused by cooling towers, and they affect a lot of people all in one go. But actually, every day there's somebody catching Legionnaire's disease from a shower hose at home, or from a workplace, or from a leisure centre, or from a hot tub. Now, in terms of where people catch Legionnaire's disease, you can see that about just under half of cases occur out in the community. So this is at work or at leisure. We've then got a big proportion associated with travel. This little yellow piece of the pie is travel within the UK, so hotels and leisure facilities within the UK. And then we've got this nice plum colour, travel outside of the UK. Now this is where you book that cheeky cheap deal at the beginning of the summer before the kids go off, and you think, great, I'll get over to Spain for a week, I'll have a nice break. You get over there, you're probably the first person to use that facility. Don't forget, we've got water tanks on roofs that are solar heated, and you jump in the shower before you go out for a beer, and unbeknownst to you, you caught Legionnaire's disease. Now, it's not going to spoil your holiday, because the incubation period for Legionella is about 10 days. It can be slightly more, but generally it's about 10 days. So you'll come home from holiday, you'll maybe get back to work for a couple of days, and then you'll start to feel a bit ill. And you think, you know, I've picked up a bug off the plane. That's what everybody says, isn't it? I've picked up a bug off the plane. And actually, you could have contracted Legionnaire's disease. Now, it starts off very much like the flu, and you'll be feeling sort of headache, muscle ache. And don't forget, this is a bacteria. So your body has the ability to fight this off. And you may just think you had a bout of the flu or some sort of bug off the plane, and then you go about your business and you're fine. Or you get the full-blown conditions, which is, you know, right the way through to pneumonia, sickness, diarrhoea, and the sort of delirium and confusion associated with a high fever. So travel.
Staff wouldn't notice.
This is your average worker on a Monday morning. So certainly travel associated cases are a big factor. We've then also got this blue slice of the pie, which is associated with nosocomial cases, so cases caught in hospitals. Now remember, we said the death rate out in the community 10 to 12%. If you catch Legionnaire's disease in hospital, there's a 40 to 45% chance you're going to die from it. So although you may be in the best place to get treatment, the chances are that you're already immunocompromised in some way because you're in hospital, one would think, and your chances of survival are much lower. I always say to people, if you don't take anything else away from the presentation today, this is the one thing to kind of focus on really, because it's the key to risk assessment. And a lot of what Gerard was saying really makes sense in terms of being pragmatic about how we approach health and safety. The danger is with Legionella particularly is it attracts people from water treatment companies to come and talk to you about my black box will deliver this and this chemical will solve all your problems. And actually an awful lot of it you can sit down and do yourselves by just taking a sensible approach. And the first thing really is that we have to kind of look at this chain of events that occurs for somebody to catch Legionnaire's disease. There has to be bacteria present in the water system. Now, I don't want to frighten anybody, but with enough time and enough bottles, I can find Legionella in practically any building. I know exactly where to look. Certainly older properties, you will find it is there. And it's all about controlling the conditions that allow it to proliferate. That's the important bit. So let's assume it's there. We then need to avoid slow-moving or stagnant water. So those disabled toilets that we lock up, keep under lock and key, that don't get used. The CEO's shower, he flies in from America once every 3 months and takes a shower. Might not be a bad thing either, really. It's those areas that are under use. Billy used to use a shower every week because he cycles in, and now he's left the company, but nobody's noticed that it's not being used anymore. That jet wash that's hooked up to a hose union tap and left full of stagnant water for weeks on end. The outside tap that feeds the sprinkler system when the weather gets warm. It's all of these things. We have to kind of bear in mind where they are and make sure we do something about them. We know that Legionella needs an adequate food source. Well, you can't do too much about it. In your average glass of water, there are all sorts of nutrients. There are organic things in there which are there quite naturally. And there's calcium, salts and sodiums and all sorts. And the Legionella will survive in there unless you've got completely distilled water. For example, then there will be enough food. But we can do things like keeping water tanks clean and not allowing them to silt up too badly. Then we've got this temperature range of 20 to 50. Well, for 99% of your properties, keeping temperatures outside of that range will be the best method of managing Legionella. You keep cold water cold, you keep hot water hot, and even if the rest of these conditions are present, no issue, because it's not going to grow. Where you can't, then obviously water treatment is a supplementary measure, and there's lots of pros and cons to that, but that's a whole different chat, and I'll skip over that. There has to be an aerosol formed, so there has to be this water spray to get that water into your lungs, and then of course there have to be people present. So clearly, if you had all of these conditions present, you'd have to be looking at, well, can I guard that process to stop an aerosol being created? Can I protect that person? But obviously we want to try to manage as many of these conditions as possible. If you break just one link in this chain, you will prevent a case of Legionnaire's disease. It's as simple as that. Now, I always say there's a very fine line with Legionella between what people know and what they don't know, between a low risk and a high risk. So somebody said in the Essex branch, I've got a pond, I have got not massive amount of water, but certainly over summer, the temperature would get above 20 degrees C. It's full of algae and other bacteria, and it's an absolute mess. And I've obviously got people kind of in my garden, and I'm kind of concerned that this might be a risk. What do you think we said? There's no aerosol. Low risk, no risk in fact. Now, if she now puts a water feature in that pond and starts spraying water around, you've now got a high risk. And that is the very fine line that we tread with Legionella every day. And usually it's to do with people being aware that actually this scenario is very low risk and this one's a very high one. And by a very simple action or inaction, we can inadvertently cause a case of Legionnaire's disease. And this happens every day. So when an outbreak occurs, where are they coming from? Well, we know that actually 36% we never find the root cause. Now remember this 10-day incubation period. Now I don't know about you lot, I don't want you to tell me, but just think about where you've been in the last 10 days. Okay, you've probably been home, you've been to work, you may have been to the leisure centre, you may have dropped your kids off at school, you may have gone to a meeting, you may have stayed in a hotel. Over that period of time, it's very difficult for us to actually pinpoint where people have caught Legionnaire's disease from. And if they're just individual cases, we may never find a cause. We only find a cause usually when there's a common factor and there's 2 or 3 people involved. So most cases actually occur, 25% come from hot and cold water systems. Surprise? I'm sure a lot of you probably thought it was cooling towers. Actually, most cases occur in calorifiers, hot water calorifiers. That's the origin when we look at it. Cooling towers certainly have their part to play, 16% arise from cooling towers. We've then got our 3rd place winner with spa pools. Now, it never used to be the case, but nowadays, spa pools account for 1/3 of all cases. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been to conferences about spa pools, and there's an awful lot of stuff I'd be worried about before I even worried about Legionella, of the kind of nasties that you can get from a spa pool. Obviously, a commercial spa that's been properly managed and treated, we shouldn't be worried about. But these days, people are buying them and putting them in at home. They're blowing them up for 300 quid and running them, you know, consecutive months and not actually knowing that they're supposed to treat them. They don't come with a warning. And so we're actually finding a lot more cases of people from home catching Legionnaire's disease from hot tubs. As I say, it's probably the least of their worries, to be fair. And I've got some pictures, because everybody likes a picture, don't they? I've got some nasties just to illustrate the point. Showers, we've obviously mentioned being a key area. They operate at these ideal temperatures. They're often associated with poor hygiene in the workplace, believe it or not. They're often infrequently used, and they're prone to limescale. And the trouble is with limescale is that it acts as like a barrier. So what happens is you get the limescale building up over a shower head or a tap, and the Legionella bacteria will grow behind the limescale. So your cleaner comes along with a nice bleach cloth and wipes over the shower head and thinks she's cleaned it, or he's cleaned it, and actually the Legionella bacteria are all perfectly happy behind this barrier. So it won't actually do any good whatsoever. That's why we have to regularly descale things like showers and taps to get rid of this harbourage. This was actually a shower at a leisure centre. It was a staff shower, and when we looked at it, we said, how often do you use this? And they said, well, we kind of don't really. What we do is use the public showers, but if we come in from a rugby game or anything and we've got muddy legs, we just sort of hose off our boots and our legs, and then we'll go and use the other shower. How often do you do that? Oh, about every 3 or 4 months. Dead legs. This is the other one particularly common in older buildings where you've got redundant pipework. Used to go off and feed something, doesn't anymore, plumber's just capped it off. Plumber will often say, well, I've got rid of the dead leg and caps it off here, but actually that's not doing the job either. A dead leg should be no more than twice that pipe's width. So if you've got a bit of 15mm pipe, then your dead leg would be classed, if you had something that was 30mm plus, that would be classed as a dead leg. So even that can be a dead leg. So what you should actually do is remove this T-piece and put a little elbow in there. It's a little bit more work for the plumber, but that's how it should occur. And the problem with dead legs is that all the water can sit in this old redundant pipework, it gets stagnant, it's nice and quiet and undisturbed, it will heat to the ambient air temperature, and that's where the bacteria are going to grow. And eventually they either grow out and into the system, or you get a pressure drop and it gets sucked out into the system. If you've then got an aerosol producing outlet further down the line, it causes a problem. Cold water storage tanks, these are my personal favourite. I think this is where the story always begins. They're always out of sight and out of mind, aren't they? They're up in the loft spaces with the rats and the bats, or if you're a housing association, the weed that's growing up there and the needles and everything else. So nobody wants to go up there. Quite often they're over capacity, so they were built in the times when mains would often go off, so they'd have lots of water storage just in case. And again, that means that they're prone to stagnation. This was actually a school. This was feeding a classroom which they said was off mains, and they were allowing their kids to fill up their water bottles from this tap, and then wondering why the kids were all complaining that they felt unwell. And when we traced it back, everything had been converted to mains apart from this one tap that still had a tank coming up. So not good really. This was actually a power station. Contractor shower block, got used 4 months of the year. The rest of the time it just sat there like this till the next time they came along and took a shower. And you can see this biofilm, this sort of crusty layer that's formed on top. This happens, this is like the waste products of all the bugs. So when Legionella lives, it doesn't live on its own, it kind of cohabits with other things. So it will hang out with other bacteria and amoebae and things. And what they do is, to protect themselves, is they throw out a sort of a mucus layer over their heads. And it's a bit like the kids' cartoons, you know, where the force field goes over, and nothing can penetrate. And it's exactly like that. So if you have a biofilm problem, if you get a water company come in and chlorinate a system, then the chlorine will get rid of any free-floating bacteria. It won't penetrate the biofilm. So actually, all you're going to do is you're going to clean anything that's in the water, and then a week later you take a sample, you've still got Legionella. And that's because you've not actually penetrated that biofilm. It acts like limescale. It stops any biocides actually getting in there. So you have to use a more aggressive and oxidising biocide. But that's often a common problem. If you're wondering why you keep getting repeat positive samples, you've probably got a biofilm problem. And chlorinating won't do the trick. What are that? Squirrels. Yeah. So you name it, we've come across them: birds, rats, bats, squirrels, dagu. We fished out one time. Things that I won't even mention before lunch, we found floating about in water tanks. People leave lids off, they leave them unprotected, and this is what gets in. And usually the first you know about it is somebody complaining that they've got fur or feathers coming out of their taps. So we really must pay more attention to our tanks. Now the problem is, as health and safety professionals, I'm sure you're probably sitting there thinking, work at height regs, because all of these are in unboarded lofts with exposed joists and fragile surfaces, or they're on unguarded roofs. So, you know, the tendency is to just ignore them. Well, you can't afford to. Hot water clarifiers, we know, are responsible for most cases. Now, these are the things that effectively are used to incubate Legionella in primary schools, for example, where they go, oh, don't want hot water because of the scalding risk. So what we'll do is we'll set this to 37 degrees C, which is about right for the kids, and then circulate it around the building. So what you've effectively done is created a Legionella incubator, and then anybody who's exposed to it is obviously at risk. So clarifier is definitely an issue. And cooling towers, we know, responsible for the big outbreaks because the drift carries over a wide area. What I wanted to do, really, is just to illustrate to you, in terms of this fine line, I wanted to give a case history which kind of illustrates the need for awareness. Now, this particular outbreak was associated with the Glasgow Royal Infirmary in 1992. And it resulted in the death of a female patient. And the source was a fire hose, which effectively had been a dead leg. It sat there stagnant over a period of time. And a maintenance engineer had been told, on a 6-monthly basis, I want you to go and test the fire hoses, make sure they're all working okay. I want you to remove the spray nozzle and run the hose directly into drain. So he was shown what to do and he was told what to do. Do you understand? Yes. And he'd done this for, you know, several years without incident. And on this one occasion, he'd got to a top floor and gone to do his fire hose testing, and he couldn't get to the drain point that he normally used. Being a diligent fellow, he's thinking, well, health and safety, you know, must flush my fire hose, make sure it works. So what I'll do is I'll chuck it out of a window and give it a good old flush. And what he didn't realise was that he then created a huge aerosol of stagnant water that then drifted down the side of this hospital. And further down there was a lady with her window open, recovering from a routine operation. She caught Legionnaire's disease and died. Now, that case was utterly preventable, as is most of them. Who thinks the engineer was at fault? Let's have a show of hands if you think he was found guilty in court. Anybody? Who thinks he wasn't guilty? There's a couple. Nobody wants to commit. Well, the bottom line is that when they investigated this case, they said, you know, the engineer failed to follow his instructions. He had a procedure, and he didn't follow it. So, you know, it would have been the written warning job, probably, except for the fact that when they looked further into it, he'd never been told why. So although he'd been told what, do this, do it this way, don't deviate from this is your procedure, nobody ever took the 30 seconds it would have taken to say, the reason I'm telling you not to create a big spray is because there's this thing called Legionella bacteria and it can kill people. It could kill you and it could kill other people. So don't ever spray stagnant water about. So if you ever find that you can't run it to a drain, don't do it at all. Oh, righto. Do you think he'd have done it? So although he wasn't found guilty, you've got to remember that this guy pretty much lost his confidence completely over this case. You know, we often talk about the victims, don't we, and the people who are affected, the people who catch Legionnaire's disease, the patient who died. But actually, the guy who caused the outbreak, you know, through default, you know, really struggled with this, and we forget that actually there are other people involved, and that's pretty much ruined his life. So what does the law say? Well, basically it all comes under the Health and Safety at Work Act, therefore also the Management of Health and Safety at Work regs, the COSH regs, and there's also the Notification of Cooling Towers regulations. So it's a workplace responsibility. So if you've got more than 5 employees, you're required to make sure that your workplace is safe from the Legionella bacteria. Those of you who've been in the game for a long time might remember the original Code of Practice from '92, and it came along with its twin HSG 70, the guidance note. And then in January 2001, it all got bunged together into one ACOP, now known as L8. Did you know that used to be the HSE's bestseller? £8 they sold it for, made them a fortune. They now sell it free, you can download it free on their website. But ACOP L8 is now being looked at under this whole health and safety review, and actually they're going to split out the guidance from the ACOP again, which is kind of what we had originally, but it's probably spent several millions in the process of consultancy to get to that point. But that's on its way. Fundamentally, the ACOP won't change dramatically, it's just that they'll split the guidance out. What it says, and this is standard health and safety stuff, so I'm going to whiz through because I'm conscious of the time, is that you have to identify and assess the source of risk, prepare a scheme to prevent or control. This is all standard health and safety stuff. Implement a manage a control programme, keep records, and appoint a responsible person. Now, that responsible person, I do a lot of work with companies, and the first thing I do is say, who's the duty holder? Who's the responsible person? And they all kind of look at each other. I don't know. Do you want to be it? Well, I know. We'll say it's the chief exec. Has anybody told him? Oh no, don't worry. We'll get him to sign a bit of paper, right? So the responsible person, what it says is that they need to be managerially responsible for implementing and supervising Legionella control. They have to ensure that everybody involved is trained and competent. They have to manage contractors and suppliers, maintain records, and make sure that regular reviews are carried out. Now, this person must have sufficient budgetary control to be able to do this. So I would argue that if you're the person who does all the testing or manages people who are doing the testing, but you don't have any budgetary control, I would say you're a relevant person, but you might not be a responsible person. The responsible person must have sufficient competence and capability and experience to be able to do that job. That is by far and away the biggest failing in every business I've audited. They do all of this beautifully. They get a risk assessment done, they run around taking water temperatures. Nobody ever actually looks at the results. Nobody looks at the data. No one says at the end of the year, are we managing Legionella through water temperature? I know the bloke comes and fills out his logbook every week, and we put it on the shelf, and that's it. That's the end of it. So if you're doing nothing else, you should be sitting down regularly and taking your records and actually saying, is this working? Are we being effective? Or has the chlorifier temperatures been low for the last 6 months, and therefore we're not actually managing Legionella at all? We thought we were. By far and away the biggest failing. And the causes of outbreaks, they say that 63% is due to a lack of scheme of control. This is the simple case of who is going to do what, when. So weekly, I'm going to get the cleaners to flush the infrequently used services. Monthly, I'm going to get somebody to take water temperatures. On a quarterly basis, we'll descale shower heads. 6 monthly, we're going to look at our storage tanks. Now, nobody ever actually writes it down in those 63% of cases. So everybody assumes somebody else is doing it, which was pretty much the fundamental cause of the Barrow and Furnace outbreak. It was kind of one of those nobody, somebody, everybody situations. There's also a quarter of all cases that are linked to a failure to have a risk assessment. Now, you wouldn't believe that in this day and age, but that's still true. 8% to do with training and competence. Now, if you think about that case with the fire hose reel, a small amount of awareness can make a big difference. And 4% is lack of cleaning and disinfection, primarily with cooling towers. One of the things that we look at when we look at outbreaks is kind of what's the common themes, and certainly this is what came out of Barrow and Furnace. The sort of key reasons why the outbreak occurred was poor communication internally. Lots of people actually were talking about Legionella and saying, we really must do something, but they weren't doing anything about it. There was no actual action. There was no implementation. So often I'll see a risk assessment and it will say, these are all the things that I need to do. It gets put on a shelf. Or actually, it might get assigned to people, but nobody actually goes back to check that it's been done and sign it off. Responsibility is not defined. The Bulmer's case was quite a famous one for this, where Bulmer's got in a contractor to manage their cooling towers and their domestic systems. Contractor engineer wasn't turning up on a regular basis and was being a bit unreliable. They had a problem. Bulmer's said, I've appointed the contractor, they've let us down. Court said, Bulmers, you're responsible for managing your contractor. If you don't make sure they show up and you don't check that they're competent, then, you know, that's up to you. And the contractor said, well, actually, we didn't know that we were supposed to be doing this aspect of the service. That wasn't in the service agreement. They hadn't made clear what Bulmers were doing and what the contractor were doing. So it's really important to have that scheme of control defined. A lack of training is often cited as the reason behind it. In the Barrow and Furness case, Gillian Beckingham was actually charged with 7 counts of manslaughter. She could have gone to prison if she'd been found guilty. But actually, her key defence was she wasn't trained. They threw the book at her anyway and said, well, you're a chartered engineer, love. You know it needs at least a risk assessment and a maintenance regime. So that didn't really wash. But lack of training is a big issue. Failure to record meetings and conversations. Again, this happens a lot. You know, you go and you say, I need to replace that clarifier because it's not getting up to temperature and it's a nightmare. And somebody above you says, I haven't got the budget for that this year. And you go, okay. And then there's an outbreak and you say, yeah, but you told me because we didn't have the budget. I never had that conversation. And if it's not written down, believe you me, when it starts to hit the fan, people that you thought were your friends are not, and conversations that you believe you had, you didn't, and unless it's there in writing, there's no evidence either way. Insufficient contract documentation is often a key factor, so failure to define between the contractor and yourselves who's responsible for what. Poor advice and management, well, we know that there's a lot of people in this industry that aren't actually sufficiently capable to offer that advice. But most crucially, the reason that often comes out when the EHOs and the HSE do the investigations is they say it all comes back to the fact that a risk assessment wasn't carried out or done properly. Last year we had a couple of outbreaks. There was the Edinburgh case, 101 cases of Legionella and 3 deaths, and then there was Stoke-on-Trent where we had 21 cases and 2 deaths associated with a hot tub that had been set up in a warehouse, discount warehouse. And people have kind of wandered in and gone, oh, I quite fancy having a hot tub in my garden. Unbeknownst to them, they're breathing in contaminated aerosol. It's kind of frightening, isn't it? I see these hot tubs everywhere, you know, car shows, game fairs. There's always somebody there with a hot tub bubbling away, and you're thinking, have you treated that? You know, where's that come from? So, you know, outbreaks are occurring all the time, and they were quite big outbreaks for us in 2012. Now, going back to what Gerard was saying earlier about looking after people, obviously our job as health and safety professionals is to make sure that we keep people safe. You have a moral obligation to do that. We also have a legal obligation, but there's also damn good financial business sense why we should manage Legionella, not least because if you have somebody go off sick, this could be an 18-month period. They may need care for the rest of their lives, which is going to get expensive. If you kill them, it's cheaper, actually. There's a loss of production and skills. If you kill off a key worker, then obviously that can cost you a lot in knowledge. We've now got fee for intervention, haven't we? 120 something pounds, isn't it? If the HSE decide to come and inspect your premises. So if they find any failing whatsoever, then they're going to charge their time back with spades. Prosecution and civil action. The Barrow and Furness case, they charged them £300,000, the council, for failures under the Corporate Manslaughter Act. They said it could have run into millions. The reason it didn't was because it was a public organisation, and obviously the taxpayer would have ended up picking up the bill, so there was no point. But if you're a commercial organisation, somebody like ABP, I dread to think. Obviously, if you're a nice hotel chain, something like this could really cause a problem, in terms of loss of business from bad publicity. Your reputation quite often is key to your business. And then, of course, you've got to think about the knock-on effect to employees. What is it actually going to do to people who've been affected by this? If their best mate has just ended up in hospital with Legionnaire's disease, how motivated are they to come to work tomorrow? They're not going to be particularly productive. That's if they turn up at all. I know of a case in a housing association where they had somebody go off sick with Legionnaire's disease, and the next day they had to implement their business continuity plan because over a third of their workforce did not come into work because it was also at a time when there was lots of coughs and splutters and flus, and they all went off to the doctor saying, I think I might have Legionnaire's disease. So it's always one to watch. So in terms of risk management, we know that risk assessment is key. We need to have regular monitoring, temperature control or water treatment or a combination of the two, regular maintenance and cleaning, regular reviews, and certainly awareness is a big part of it. And I just wanted to mention with the risk assessment, It has to be, it says in ACOP L8, suitable and sufficient. Well, there's been a big argument about what that actually means. It also should be changed if there's a change of use of the building or a change of plumbing system. You should actually review that part of the assessment again, and it should be reviewed every 2 years by a competent person. Now, one of the issues that we've had, I've seen lots of risk assessments over the years, everything from a tick sheet to a folder this thick for a primary school, which had information in it about softeners and cooling towers and things that they didn't even have. So making something suitable and sufficient is quite tricky. And so what we said as an industry is we need a standard. We need to make sure that people like you who are buying risk assessments know what to expect. So they came up with British Standard 8580. And the idea was to try and standardise the approach to make sure that people were not just doing a tick sheet of assets, but actually doing a risk assessment. That tank, which we've said needs an insect screen, a lid, insect screens on the overflows, and it needs a tank breather, and it needs relining and cleaning. Actually, what was it feeding? One tap? Well, let's get rid of it. Nobody was doing that, and so they're trying to encourage that. We're also trying to meet the standards expected by EHOs and the HSE, although they conflict in what they want. One of them wants a quantitative assessment, and the other wants a qualitative assessment, so we haven't got quite as far as that yet. But it certainly places much more emphasis on appraisal of records. So if you have a risk assessment done under this standard, they'll be looking at what have you recorded up until now, how quickly do you respond if you get a non-compliance, how long are remedial works left. So there's much more emphasis on the management these days. Your risk assessment is a snapshot in time. You have to be aware that if you do a risk assessment on a day like today and then another one in summer, you're going to get two different pictures. So there is a requirement for ongoing control, and that is risk assessment driven. So your risk assessment will determine what your scheme of control will be, but just kind of generically, you're looking at things like weekly flushing of infrequent use services, monthly temperature monitoring, quarterly shower head disinfection and descaling, looking at your cold water storage tanks every 6 months, doing an annual review of the scheme, biannual risk assessment review, and then cleaning and disinfection as and when required. There's a lot of companies out there that will say, oh, you must clean your tanks annually. That's rubbish. The only time you clean your tank annually is if it's a drinking water tank. If it contains potable water, then yes. If it's just feeding showers and toilets, no. As and when required. And then the monitoring we basically do is this programme for continual assessment to try to demonstrate that we're actually being effective in our control. And bottom line is we do it because we have to comply with the guidance. So ACOP L8 says that we have to carry out this monitoring on a regular basis. I just want to speak very quickly about contract management because I know the food's here and you're probably all desperate now. But this is one of the biggest failings as well. You should make sure that if you're going to use a contractor that they are registered. There's the thing called the Legionella Control Association, which is a voluntary code of conduct that suppliers subscribe to, which should give you some confidence that they're going to meet a certain set of standards. It doesn't always mean they will because it's voluntary, but we are audited and we do have people come and check that we are actually complying. Do use things like British Standard 8580 for risk assessments and 8558 for things like chlorinations and disinfections to make sure that people are actually following a standard rather than just doing it their way. Do ask people for training records and CVs. Even if your company has gone through a procurement process and been found to be very reliable, is that engineer who actually comes to your site trained? Often not. Make sure you ask for references. Do agree service levels early on. If you do a risk assessment, when am I going to get my report? I was doing some training the other day and they said, I've just got my report. It says that my urgent actions had to be done within 4 weeks, but they did the risk assessment 6 months ago, so now all of my actions are overdue. That's no good. Make sure you agree areas of responsibility as per this scheme of control that we spoke about, and regularly review. They say with a big contract, if you've got a large property or multiple sites, then it should be at least quarterly. If you're a smaller operation, then certainly annually would be fine. Do check your logbook records, whether they're physical records or whether they're electronic. It's down to you to review, and you'll never get away from that. Even if you farm everything else out, it's still down to you to review whether it's being effective or not. All right, so just in terms of the future, we mentioned about what's going on, the rising cases, what's happening to our population. We're ageing. So we've got a rise in susceptible people. So already we're fighting a losing battle because there are going to be a bigger pool of people that can be affected by this bacteria. More TMVs, because building regs, they're going in everywhere. Thermostatic mixer valves, anybody got them in their sites? Got a service contract? Keep your hand up. Some of you have, yeah. So often these things are being fitted. They are known to harbour Legionella bacteria. If they're not cleaned and serviced regularly, you're actually introducing more of a problem. Things like MRSA and swine flu, we're finding in hospitals, they're using alcohol gel a lot more. Nobody's using the sinks anymore, and so their big swimming pool sized tanks in their roofs are going stagnant. So by fighting off one bacteria, we're making ourselves problems with others. People using office water coolers and water boilers. Nobody uses the kitchen sink to fill up the kettle anymore. Might be a stagnant area you've not thought about. And then these blooming infrared taps, you know, the ones where you have to wave for 10 minutes and eventually it spits a bit of water out at you. They're designed for low flow. They're designed to reduce the amount of water that you use, which is great on an environmental front, but unfortunately it means that you're not physically getting hot water to pasteurise that outlet on a regular basis. Solar heating installations, again, you know, sometimes people go, oh great, you know, the solar heating's got up to 35 degrees C, that's warm enough. Don't bother, it's preheat, it should have a secondary measure and they don't bother with it. And then global warming in general, we've obviously got to be concerned about because temperatures are going to rise. We are going to have an increased period when the bacteria is viable in terms of the seasons. And I'm standing here and saying to you, you know, you need to flush your outlets and you need to keep your temperatures at 60 degrees C. And of course, people are trying to reduce temperatures and reduce water use from an energy perspective. So you've got the two conflicting things going on there. So of course, you know, environmental factors are going to play a part and we will have to take that into consideration. But until then, keeping water moving and keeping water hot is our best line of defence, really. So just going back to my point at the beginning, is it worth worrying about? I would hope after our quick rattle through Legionella that you would agree it certainly is. And it's something which, you know, we shouldn't neglect when there's lots of other pressing things going on. So thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon. Did you want to open up for questions or are we going to
Any questions?
go straight in for lunch? I will just leave up here if anybody needs it. We have our helpline number, so after today, if you do have any questions that you wanted to cover off that you haven't had time to raise today, then by all means call our office and they'll help.
Thank you very much.
You're
That was brief now. Thank you.
IOSH Networks Audio.